For days, the main focus of the war between Ukraine and Russia had shifted to the southern sectors of the front. However, Kyiv recently changed its tactics and redirected its efforts toward Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, a city that carries the potential to alter the course of the war. In this city, which has been fortified since 2014 and remains under Russian occupation influence, Ukraine's most elite paratrooper units took center stage on the battlefield. Their objective was to prevent Putin from fully seizing the fortress belt through Pokrovsk. If Russian forces managed to capture the historic defensive belt formed by the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk-Drushkivka-Kostiantynivka line, they would gain the opportunity to advance toward Dnipro. In fact, as part of this occupation plan, the Kremlin had deployed a total of 99,000 troops around Pokrovsk in recent months. Russian mechanized units, armored brigades, and infantry formations maintained a ruthless occupation effort to block any Ukrainian forces from entering the city. The large number of Russian military personnel in Pokrovsk had also been officially confirmed by Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrskyi. In other words, the task facing Ukraine's paratrooper units in the city was extremely difficult. Countering the occupation forces that had surrounded every side of the city and achieving a breakthrough there was almost dependent on miracles. The Russian army was likely relying heavily on its massive numerical superiority in troops and equipment in the area. As a natural result of this overconfidence, Russian military planners had shifted their main focus to continued advances on the southern and eastern axes rather than securing the rear areas around Pokrovsk. Yet Ukraine's air assault units and other formations had actually been quietly and thoroughly analyzing Russian military movements in the city for a long time. The locations of VTOL drone systems that were creating the main pressure on Ukrainian positions and were skillfully hidden inside civilian structures were being identified one by one. In particular, Ukraine's electronic warfare and military intelligence units mapped out this network of hidden Russian drone facilities in Pokrovsk using complex signal tracking and precise geolocation methods. Then came the expected strategic move from Kyiv to target these critical enemy strike points right in the heart of the city. Because at that exact moment, everything was ready for Kyiv's paratrooper units to break the occupation force in Pokrovsk. At this critical juncture, the Ukrainian General Staff committed the 7th Air Assault Corps, one of its most elite air assault formations, along with the 4th Ranger Regiment, which specializes in special operations. This move was recorded as one of the most pivotal steps in Pokrovsk in recent times. Both of Ukraine's air assault regiments targeted a total of 6 different Russian drone launch sites that had been carefully hidden inside the city's civilian architecture. According to United 24, Russian forces had set up these launch sites near a library, inside a household goods store, and around a cafe in the city center in order to avoid drawing attention and to remain camouflaged. Even a damaged ordinary house in a civilian residential area was being used as the main launch ramp for these VTOL systems. Crucially, the unmanned systems hidden at these locations were not ordinary devices. The majority were Molniya type or similar VTOL/hybrid unmanned systems. These platforms could take off and land vertically from narrow civilian areas, apartment courtyards, or gardens without requiring traditional launch ramps. Among them were also satellite-linked variants, such as the Molniya 2R, that possessed electronic warfare resistance and could serve as repeaters. After months of meticulous intelligence analysis, Ukraine's paratrooper units finally pressed the button on the strike operation against these complex targets on June 13th. The operation began within seconds, as fixed-wing Ukrainian attack drones were directed with high precision to the exact coordinates. The units applied very specific tactics to neutralize only the designated Russian military equipment with pinpoint strikes, while avoiding unnecessary damage to civilian structures. By the end of the day, all 6 identified drone takeoff and landing sites had been successfully destroyed without a single loss. The coordination between advanced military technology and battlefield discipline displayed by Ukraine's air assault units during this operation was remarkable. However, what Russia lost in Pokrovsk after the operation became even more striking. First and foremost, the occupation force's aerial reconnaissance and strike capability, which had been continuously pressuring Ukrainian logistics routes and frontline positions from the sky, was seriously degraded. These VTOL drones used by the Russians provided the occupation forces with invaluable tactical flexibility, because of their ability to launch from narrow civilian areas. With these systems, Putin's army was able to infiltrate deep behind Ukrainian trenches and attack supply convoys carrying vital ammunition on the roads. The destruction of these centers significantly reduced the Russian occupation forces' real-time intelligence gathering and rapid attrition capacity in the city. For Putin, this new situation on the ground served as the clearest and most painful proof that even in a city like Pokrovsk, which he believed was under absolute control, his forces were not safe. Being suddenly struck well behind the front line caused deep demoralization within the occupation army's command echelons and among the troops fighting on the ground. Ukraine, on the other hand, gained valuable and significant breathing room on the battlefield after this successful and bold step. The temporary disruption of the Russian unmanned aerial vehicle threat in Pokrovsk allowed Ukrainian infantry to remain safer in their trenches and eased pressure on logistics lines. Moreover, conducting such a precise operation right in the center of occupied territory once again demonstrated the Ukrainian army's electronic superiority. Yet everything described on the battlefield was actually only the visible tip of a much larger strategic iceberg. Because behind these seemingly specific and limited scope operations lay far greater effects that could shift regional balances. The city of Pokrovsk has represented one of the most vital and busiest logistics arteries in the region since the beginning of the war. The city sits at the exact intersection of key rail networks and the main highways feeding the Eastern Front, functioning like a major artery. Ukraine's point operations against enemy drone bases directly determine the security of these critical logistics lines in and around the city. As is well known, Russian forces wanted to seize control of critical highways, such as the T0504 and T0508, and completely strangle Ukraine's supply routes. In particular, the T0504 highway feeding the Kramatorsk and Sloviansk axis had turned into the center of operations in recent months and had become the #1 target of Russian forces. This critical route runs from Pokrovsk to Kostiantynivka, and from there directly supplies the Ukrainian defensive lines at Chasiv Yar. The west-east M04 and E50 highways served as another main artery, bringing heavy armored reinforcements into the city from the Dnipro and Pavlohrad directions. In addition to the highways, the rail resupply provided through the Pokrovsk train station also sat at the very center of this massive logistics knot. In early 2025, the Russians succeeded in cutting the vital rail link between Dnipro and Pokrovsk, seriously slowing Ukraine's logistics tempo. Seeking to overcome this terrible bottleneck, the Ukrainian army was forced to turn to unmanned robotic transport systems, alternative muddy backroads, and night convoys moving while hidden from thermal cameras. With this latest air assault operation in Pokrovsk, Ukraine delivered a move that disrupted the Russian effort to establish dominance over the logistics routes. In response, the T0508 highway between Pokrovsk and Attrition was turned by Ukrainian units into a defensive pocket, where transit was completely blocked for Russian assault groups. According to data provided by drone operators from Ukraine's 7th Corps, a full 100 Russian soldiers were neutralized on just a 2-kilometer open section of this road in the last 50 days alone. Russian vanguard units attempting to move along this corridor, which offered no natural cover, were taken out of action the moment they stepped into Ukraine's perfectly established aerial network. Through such actions, Ukrainian units kept the life corridor needed for logistics convoys to deliver ammunition to the front more safely, continuously open. In reality, Ukraine's strategic posture in Pokrovsk was not new, because the only military action in the city was not the June 13th operation by the air assault units that destroyed those 6 drone bases. On June 5th, another very critical and impactful operation had also been successfully carried out right in the center of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian army had conducted another perfect precision airstrike against a highly advanced Molniya-type Russian drone launch base positioned in the city center. This earlier impactful operation had already seriously disrupted the Russian drone unit's reconnaissance capability on the front and had signaled the approaching main operation. In fact, the foundation for the successive tactical successes we are witnessing in Pokrovsk today had been carefully woven on the ground since May. Throughout May, Ukrainian units conducted non-stop counter-battery operations against Russian artillery systems and hidden drone launch points day and night. During this intense process, new-generation drone teams established in cooperation with elite units, such as Magyar's Birds, continuously hunted Russian logistics convoys and armored personnel concentrations. Through these types of rear-area operations, Ukraine recorded an incredible statistic by conducting a record number of strikes against Russian targets in a single day. In other words, the major strike on June 13th was not a sudden flash, but the most perfect result of a patient and highly systematic attrition strategy that had been ongoing for months. On the other hand, following all these successive tactical disasters and infrastructure losses, the Russian army gradually began to lose its heavy occupation momentum in Pokrovsk. While Russia tried to target Ukrainian positions from the sky with massive KAB and FAB series glide bombs, on the ground it pursued a completely attrition-oriented meat wall strategy. Ruthlessly applying its air denial campaign doctrine on the battlefield, Russia attacked with all its might to cut logistics routes, yet its advances occurred only millimeter by millimeter. Because even in Pokrovsk and its immediate surroundings alone, Putin's units had suffered incredibly large and difficult-to-replace military losses in recent weeks. In this relentless process where Russia was losing more than 1,000 soldiers per day on average, loss ratios in some sectors had climbed to a surprising 10-to-1 level in Ukraine's favor. In response, the Kiev headquarters wasted no time in expanding these small but extremely critical gains achieved around Pokrovsk into a wider area. To execute this vision, Ukraine created an extremely solid, flexible, and in-depth new military structure around the city. In the region, not only the 7th Air Assault Corps managing air operations, but also many experienced and high-impact ground brigades were operating side by side on rotation. For example, the 42nd Separate Mechanized Brigade established a highly coordinated defensive line around this agglomeration, forming a steel wall against Russian infiltrations. On the northern and western flanks of the region, the 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade stood ready at all times with its heavy artillery elements to immediately repel enemy advances. The most difficult urban combat among the ruins inside the city and in its immediate surroundings was shouldered with great resilience by the 68th Separate Jaeger Brigade. Additionally, the 3rd Spartan Operational Brigade under the National Guard played a critical role in destroying Russian platoon-level assaults attempting to infiltrate using motorcycles and light off-road vehicles before they could reach the positions. The legendary 25th Air Assault Brigade, conducting independent operations in the region, exerted tremendous effort in sudden raids around the city and infiltration missions behind enemy lines. At the same time, the legendary 93rd Mechanized Brigade was making the battlefield extremely difficult for the Russians, with counter-battery fire aimed at protecting logistics lines on the western flank and silencing enemy artillery. The artillery power of this massive defensive shield was provided by the 152nd Grenadier Brigade, which never allowed Russian unmanned aerial vehicle centers to see the light of day. All of these dedicated military units are fighting to permanently end the Russian army's dream of reaching the main defensive belt, called the Fortress Belt, and pushing toward Dnipropetrovsk. This new defensive structure being applied is not limited to simply waiting in dug trenches. It is also based on a highly mobile and completely technology-driven attrition strategy. Thanks to this modern tactical approach, the defensive line has been divided into 3 solid layers: mechanized brigades and minefields on the forward edge, dense drone kill zones in the middle layer, and long-range deep strikes in the rear area. Traditional deep defensive lines have been integrated with fiber-optic drone networks and rapid reaction units, inflicting very heavy costs on the enemy with every step it takes. So what awaits us next in Pokrovsk? In the coming period, it appears highly likely that the intense fighting around the city will evolve into an even more sophisticated electronic and unmanned aerial warfare. Although Russia continues to attempt wave-style assaults by leveraging its massive troop numbers on the ground, the successive loss of qualified military infrastructure is effectively locking down advances on the battlefield. Ukraine's data-driven, precision strike tactics are proving to the entire modern military world how even armies of enormous size can turn into blind and clumsy forces on the battlefield. In the coming months, Ukraine is expected to intensify these types of strategic infiltration and air operations against Russian rear logistics lines, not only in Pokrovsk, but across the entire eastern axis. In conclusion, this strategic drone base operation carried out by Ukraine's paratroopers in Pokrovsk created a massive breaking point in the overall course of the war that appears small, but whose effects are spreading in waves. The thin line between merely having numerical superiority on the battlefield and achieving full dominance through military intelligence has once again become clearly defined in favor of technology and patient intelligence. The skillful neutralization of these invisible Russian drone threats, which had been mercilessly hidden among civilians, with zero civilian casualties, is opening a new page in 21st century modern warfare doctrine. In other words, the Pokrovsk front is demonstrating to all of us through lived experience just how vital patience, accurate information, tactics, and making the right move at the right time can be on the battlefield. So what do you think about this topic? Will Ukraine's new generation defensive doctrine, built with unmanned systems and air assault units on the battlefield, be sufficient to completely stop Russia's traditional war machine in the long term? What direction will the ability to conduct such flawless intelligence operations well behind the front line actually steer the course of the war in the coming days? We are waiting for your comments. To make long journeys more enjoyable, we also invite you to our Spotify channel, where we present our video content. Thank you for choosing us. Presented by TGN.